Daniel Carter was the kind of man people envied, an untouchable CEO with a mansion, a fleet of cars, and a name that commanded respect. But behind the golden gates was a father drowning in silence. His 6-year-old son hadn't smiled in years, not since the night a crash stole his mother. Therapists failed. Money failed. And then, on the most ordinary evening, a single wrong number changed everything. Daniel thought he was calling the babysitter. Instead, a stranger showed up at his door. And in less than an hour, that stranger did what no one else could. She made his broken son laugh. Stay with us, because this isn't just a story about a babysitter. It's about the wrong call that turned into a miracle, and the moment a single dad discovered family again. Daniel Carter's days had long become a blur of boardrooms and bedtime stories, of quarterly reports and quiet tears behind a closed office door. 3 years had passed since the night his wife's car never made it home, yet the silence she left behind still wrapped around their mansion like a shroud. To the world, he was Daniel Carter, CEO of one of the city's most powerful firms, a man with a glass-walled office and an empire at his fingertips. But within the marble walls of his house, he was just a single dad clinging to the frayed edges of fatherhood, raising a boy who had stopped trusting the world. Ethan, his 6-year-old son, was bright-eyed once, full of laughter. Now he retreated into himself, speaking only when necessary, wary of strangers, and clutching his drawings like shields. Daniel had tried everything: specialists, child therapists, endless programs. Nothing pierced through the fortress of grief his boy had built. And then came the evening that would alter the rhythm of their lives forever. It was a Thursday, the kind of evening when the city lights blurred in his windshield as he sped home, his phone vibrating endlessly with reminders. A board meeting awaited him, a presentation to investors that could shift millions. But his sitter, reliable, trusted, had canceled last minute. Panic gnawed at his gut as he scrolled through the contact list, searching for alternatives. Ethan couldn't be left alone, not even for an hour. With his thumb clumsy from urgency, Daniel hit a number he thought belonged to a recommended sitter. The voice that answered wasn't who he expected. "Hello?" The tone was warm, surprised, slightly hesitant. "This is Daniel Carter. I need a babysitter tonight, immediately," he blurted, not stopping to explain. "It's urgent. My son's 6. I'll compensate well." There was a pause, the kind that carried more than hesitation. It carried a weight Daniel was too rushed to notice. I suppose I could," the woman said softly. "Give me the address." He rattled it off without thinking, already snapping his laptop shut and preparing Ethan's dinner plate before bolting for the meeting. He never questioned why she hadn't asked how long, or why she didn't introduce herself. All he knew was that someone was coming, and that was enough. Her name was Grace Miller. She had been a teacher once, beloved by her students, until life demanded she step away. Her mother's illness had swallowed her savings. Her job gone after a smear from a jealous colleague left her reputation in tatters. For months she'd been piecing together part-time work while spending long hours in hospital corridors. When the strange call came, her instinct was to decline. She had no experience as a professional sitter, only years guiding classrooms of children. But something in the caller's urgency, perhaps the desperation in his clipped voice, pushed her to say yes. She told herself it was just one night. By the time she arrived at the Carter estate, the city sky was bruised with twilight. She stood at the iron gates, clutching her coat tighter, feeling dwarfed by the sprawling mansion ahead. Grace had never stepped inside a world like this, where windows glowed gold against stone facades and luxury hummed through every line of architecture. When the door opened, it was not the CEO who greeted her, but the small boy with solemn eyes. Ethan's gaze met hers, unflinching yet curious. Children often needed time to adjust, especially those carrying loss. Grace braced herself for the walls he would raise. But then, without a word, he stepped closer, tilting his head as though studying a secret. When she knelt and offered a quiet hello, his lips twitched into something Daniel hadn't seen in months, a smile, small and fleeting, but real. Grace felt the shift immediately. She reached into her bag, pulling out a simple notepad she carried for her mother's hospital notes. "Do you like drawing?" she asked gently. Ethan nodded. His hand found hers for a moment, leading her inside, past the marble foyer and crystal chandelier that glistened overhead, into a house echoing with silence. Daniel caught the scene as he rushed out, his son's small hand holding a stranger's without hesitation. He froze for a heartbeat, stunned. Therapists had failed. Family friends couldn't get past Ethan's guardedness. Yet here, in the span of minutes, this unknown woman had crossed a threshold no one else could. "Thank you," Daniel muttered hurriedly, torn between relief and disbelief. His tie hung crooked as he grabbed his briefcase. "I'll be back as soon as I can." He doesn't open up easily. His eyes lingered on Ethan's smile 1 second longer, before he forced himself toward the waiting car. As the mansion door closed behind him, Daniel couldn't shake the image burned into his mind. Ethan smiling at a stranger. For the first time in years, a spark of hope pierced the fog of his exhaustion. He had no idea that his desperate wrong call had set into motion the most extraordinary chapter of their lives. Grace followed Ethan into the house, her footsteps muffled against polished marble floors that gleamed under the chandelier's light. Everything about the mansion whispered elegance: grand staircases, oil paintings, glass vases brimming with orchids. But beneath the splendor was a kind of hollowness she couldn't ignore. The air felt too still, the rooms too quiet, as though laughter had been banished long ago. To Grace, it looked like a museum built for admiration, not a home built for warmth. Ethan, small in his socks, padded across the vast foyer and led her toward the living room. His hand clutched her notepad as if it were treasure. He didn't speak, but his trust spoke louder than words. Grace set her bag down and studied him, sensing that his silence wasn't the ordinary shyness of children, but something heavier, like grief pressed into his bones. She recognized that look. She had seen it in students who carried burdens too large for their age. On the coffee table sat untouched toys, neatly arranged as though waiting for a child who no longer wanted them. A grand piano rested against the far wall, its black lid closed, its keys untouched, dustless but lifeless, like an instrument meant for display rather than music. Grace sat on the rug, pulling Ethan down beside her. She began to sketch a quick doodle: a crooked house, a stick figure with wild hair, a dog with ears far too big. Ethan watched intently, then reached for the pen. His small hand scratched lines beside hers, clumsy but eager. When he drew a smiley face, Grace laughed softly, and the boy's lips curved, tentative but certain. It was the second smile in a single night. Hours stretched gently. Dinner had been left out on the counter: simple pasta, a plate too large for such a small child. Grace reheated it, humming under her breath, and coaxed Ethan to eat. He did so quietly but without protest. She noticed how he glanced at her now and then, as though testing whether she would disappear if he blinked. To keep the air light, she invented a story about a rabbit who built a rocket out of carrots. Her voice animated. She made sound effects that filled the sterile dining room with something playful. Ethan let out a sudden laugh, high and clear, so unexpected that Grace nearly dropped her fork. She froze, heart tightening, then joined him in laughter, grateful for the fragile gift he had offered. Meanwhile, Daniel drove through the city toward his meeting, though his thoughts kept circling back to the scene he had left behind. Ethan had smiled. For years he had tried everything to coax that joy back into his son's face, but nothing worked. Now, a stranger had accomplished it in mere minutes. He wanted to believe it was real, but fear tightened around his chest. Hope was dangerous. It could shatter you when it slipped away. By the time he returned home late that evening, his nerves buzzed with questions. Through the half-open door of Ethan's room, Daniel saw his boy curled up in bed, a drawing taped proudly to the knitstand. Beside him sat Grace, reading in a low, soothing voice from a book she must have found on the shelf. Ethan's eyes were heavy, but he was listening, clutching the corner of the notepad as though it were a lifeline. Daniel stood in the doorway longer than he intended, struck by the domesticity of the scene. For a fleeting second, he saw what their home might look like if it were whole again, if warmth and laughter returned to its halls. When Grace noticed him, she closed the book and rose carefully, whispering goodnight to Ethan. The boy murmured something Daniel almost didn't catch. Stay. It was the first time in years Ethan had asked anyone to stay. Daniel's throat tightened. He gestured for Grace to follow him into the hall. He doesn't usually ask that, he said quietly, searching her face as though trying to decipher how she had done it. Grace shook her head, humility soft in her eyes. Children feel what they feel. Maybe he just needed someone new to listen. Daniel didn't know whether to be grateful or suspicious. He had spent so long protecting Ethan that trust had become a foreign language. Yet the evidence was undeniable. Ethan had laughed, drawn, and spoken a word of longing. Daniel thanked her briefly, his tone clipped, unsure how much of himself to reveal. But as Grace left that night, he couldn't escape the gnawing realization that his son had come alive, if only for a moment, in her presence. For Grace, the night left its own impression. Walking down the driveway, she thought of the mansion's silence, of a boy's hesitant smile, of a single dad whose eyes carried exhaustion behind their steel. She had only meant to help for a few hours, but something told her this would not be the last time she stepped through that door. The following days unfolded with a rhythm Daniel had not known in years. Grace came back, first because Ethan asked for her, then because Daniel, torn between hesitation and relief, allowed it. She didn't act like a sitter. She behaved more like someone who belonged, never imposing, never performing. She simply listened, and that Daniel realized was what his son craved most. Ethan's drawings grew bolder, colors filling the paper where once he had drawn only gray stick figures. He began to hum faintly at the breakfast table. For Daniel, these small changes were nothing short of miracles. Still, questions gnawed at him. Who was this woman who had stepped so effortlessly into their silence? He could not entrust Ethan's fragile heart to chance. Quietly, he had his assistant do a background check, something reflexive in a world where every deal demanded due diligence. The report surprised him. Grace Miller, former award-winning elementary teacher. Record of glowing recommendations from parents and students alike. Then a sharp fall 3 years ago. Accusations of negligence, a child's injury on the playground, whispers of misconduct. She had resigned before the investigation ended, her reputation stained though no wrongdoing was proven. Daniel read the report twice, frowning. Something about it rang hollow, like a puzzle missing a piece. When he asked her directly one evening, Grace didn't flinch. They were sitting in the living room, Ethan asleep upstairs. Grace traced a finger along the edge of her notebook before answering. A colleague. She envied how the kids connected with me. One day a boy fell on the playground, broke his arm. She said I had left him unattended. It wasn't true. But in that world, whispers spread faster than truth. I resigned rather than fight a battle I couldn't win. My mother was falling ill anyway. I thought I'd find peace outside the classroom. Her voice didn't crack, but Daniel heard the wound beneath the words. It reminded him of boardroom betrayals, of how easily power twisted stories. He surprised himself by believing her. The light in Ethan's eyes was testimony enough. A week later, a discovery changed everything. The grand piano in the corner had sat untouched since Daniel's wife passed. She had been the musician in the family, her fingers bringing warmth into the coldest nights. After her death, Daniel couldn't bear the sound, and Ethan avoided it entirely. That evening, Grace noticed Ethan staring at the piano, his small hands twitching. She crouched beside him. "Want to hear a secret?" she whispered. When I was your age, my house was very loud. My father drank. My mother worked nights. The piano was the only place I felt safe. Just pressing a key made me feel less alone. Do you want to try?" Ethan shook his head at first. His eyes flicked to Daniel, who stood tense in the doorway. Grace didn't push. Instead, she sat down herself, pressing a single note, a soft lingering C that hung in the air like a sigh. Then she played a simple melody, nothing more than a children's tune, clumsy but tender. Ethan edged closer, curiosity outpacing his fear. Tentatively, he climbed onto the bench beside her. His finger pressed one ivory key, then another. The sound wobbled, uncertain, but it was sound nonetheless. Daniel's breath caught. He gripped the doorframe, fighting the burn in his throat. For 3 years, that piano had been a tomb. Now it was alive again, awakened not by his wife, but by the stranger who had stumbled into their lives. Ethan looked up at Grace, eyes wide, and for the first time in years, he whispered, "Again." The single word pierced Daniel's chest. He nearly wept, but he held still, unwilling to disturb the fragile magic unfurling before him. Grace smiled and nodded, beginning the tune once more, letting Ethan's small hands fall where they wished. Later that night, when Ethan finally fell asleep, Daniel found himself standing in the kitchen with Grace, silence stretching between them. "You don't understand what you did," he said at last, his voice rough. "He hasn't gone near that piano since his mother." He trailed off, unable to finish. Grace set her hand on the counter, steady, compassionate. "Children carry grief in ways we can't predict. Sometimes they just need someone to remind them it's safe to feel again." Daniel stared at her, words caught in his throat. Gratitude warred with fear. He wanted to thank her, but the depth of what she had given was beyond language. Instead, he only nodded, retreating to his office with emotions too large to bear. Alone, he pressed his palm against the cool glass window, staring out at the city lights. For the first time since his wife's death, he allowed himself to imagine that maybe, just maybe, he and Ethan could find their way back to life. And the thought terrified him as much as it set him free. For weeks, the Carters' mansion began to feel less like a mausoleum and more like a home. Ethan was laughing more, daring to play simple duets with Grace on the piano. Daniel, though still cautious, found himself lingering in the living room instead of escaping to his office. Yet in the quiet hours, doubts haunted him. He had built his career on control, on predicting risks and shielding his company from crises. Opening the door of his life to Grace, someone with a scarred past and unsteady circumstances, felt like gambling with the one thing he couldn't afford to lose, his son. One evening, as Daniel returned from a late dinner with investors, he paused at the front hall when he heard Grace's voice from the kitchen. It wasn't her usual gentle tone. It was strained, urgent. He stayed in the shadows, guilty for eavesdropping, until the words made him freeze. "Yes, I understand, but she needs that treatment now. I'll find a way to pay the hospital. Please, don't delay her tests." Grace's voice cracked, desperation breaking through her composure. "I don't care if it puts me in debt. She's all I have." The call ended, leaving silence heavy in the kitchen. Daniel's instinct as a father surged. He wanted to step in, to offer money, doctors, anything. Yet he also knew Grace's pride. He had seen it in the way she shrugged off kindness, in the dignity she clung to despite her fall from the classroom. He walked away quietly, vowing to help in a way that wouldn't wound her dignity. But life had other plans. Days later, Daniel's world and Grace's collided under the merciless eye of the public. A media outlet unearthed the old scandal that had driven Grace from teaching. A headline blared across social media: "Former teacher with troubled past working as caretaker for CEO's son." The article rehashed every rumor, painting her as negligent, even dangerous. By the time Daniel's team flagged the news, the story had spread across investor chat rooms and parenting blogs. Within hours, Daniel's board was calling. "This could damage our reputation, Daniel," one director warned coldly. "A woman with that history near your child, it's reckless." Daniel paced his office, fury clawing through him. The irony was bitter. Strangers who had never met Grace judged her by whispers, while he had seen his son's healing unfold in her presence. Still, the weight of his role pressed on him. If he stood by her and the rumors proved true, Ethan's fragile recovery could shatter. If he let her go, he would betray not only Grace but also the boy who had whispered again at the piano. The choice gutted him. The breaking point came at a charity gala he was obligated to attend. The ballroom shimmered with chandeliers, filled with reporters and socialites hungry for gossip. Daniel had asked Grace to stay home, but fate intervened. She arrived at the event with Ethan, unaware of the headlines exploding online until she walked into the sea of flashing cameras. Gasps rippled as someone recognized her. Voices rose, sharp and cruel. "Is that the disgraced teacher? How could Carter trust her with his son?" Grace's face went pale, her composure cracking under the weight of judgment. She turned to leave, but Ethan clung to her hand, refusing to let go. Then, something extraordinary happened. Ethan, the boy who had barely spoken in 3 years, stepped forward in front of the crowd. His small voice trembled but carried through the stunned silence. "She makes me happy again." 4 simple words. They sliced through the venom of gossip like light breaking through storm clouds. The crowd froze, cameras catching every second. Grace knelt, tears welling in her eyes, as Ethan buried his face in her shoulder. Daniel moved without hesitation. He walked to them, placed a steady hand on Grace's back, and faced the crowd. "Enough," he said, his voice steel. "This woman is not what the headlines say. She is the reason my son smiles again. She is the reason he plays the piano that belonged to his mother. She has done what doctors and specialists could not. She gave him hope. And I will not let anyone take that away." His words, sharp and unyielding, echoed across the ballroom. Reporters captured the image. The powerful CEO standing not with a polished board member or glamorous partner, but with a maligned woman and his fragile child. The board would rage, the media would spin, but Daniel no longer cared. His choice was clear. He had built empires from numbers and contracts, but this moment demanded something greater: courage. And as Ethan's small hand tightened in Grace's, Daniel knew that for the first time in years, he had chosen the right battle. In the days after the gala, Daniel braced for fallout. The board demanded explanations, investors worried about optics, and media pundits dissected every word of his speech. Yet what lingered most in the public imagination wasn't the scandal. It was Ethan's trembling voice saying, "She makes me happy again." Clips of that moment flooded social media, sparking a conversation about compassion and second chances. While some critics clung to suspicion, many others rallied around Grace, praising Daniel for standing by her. For the first time in years, Daniel felt he was leading with his heart rather than his title. Grace, however, struggled. She had never sought attention, and the sudden spotlight made her wary. At the hospital, she sat beside her mother's bed, holding her hand while tabloids speculated outside. "I didn't ask for this," she whispered one evening when Daniel came to visit. He brought flowers, awkward in his expensive suit in the sterile hospital room. "I know," he said quietly, "but you've given Ethan something priceless. Let me give something back." She shook her head at first, her pride a fortress. But as medical bills mounted and her mother's condition worsened, she realized refusing help was no longer strength, it was fear. Grace finally allowed Daniel to cover the treatment, though only under the condition that he not call it charity. "Then it's an investment," he said gently, "in both of you." When her mother stabilized, Grace began to think about her future. Returning to teaching felt impossible. The system had turned its back on her. But she couldn't ignore what she had seen in Ethan, the power of music and art to pull a child back from silence. Over dinner one evening, she voiced the idea hesitantly. What if there was a place? Not a school, exactly, but a center where kids who've lost something parents trust, even their voice, could find healing through art. Daniel listened, his son sketching at the table between them. A center where music, stories, painting could be medicine. His gaze softened. You don't need to ask if it's possible. Just tell me how to help. Weeks later, blueprints spread across the Carter dining table, pencils and crayons mingling with corporate spreadsheets. Grace named it the Harmony Center, and Daniel insisted on funding it, not as a project under his company's name, but as a private promise. The opening night was modest, but the rooms were filled with children holding brushes, tapping drums, and whispering lines of poetry. Parents watched with tears as kids who had been too shy to speak began to laugh in chorus. Ethan stood proudly at the piano, his hair neatly combed, his fingers nervous but determined. Grace knelt beside him before the recital. Remember, it's not about playing it perfectly. It's about letting people hear your heart. He nodded, then struck the first notes of a melody Grace had taught him. The tune was simple, uneven, but as the sound carried through the hall, Daniel's eyes blurred. He sat in the front row, hands clasped, watching his son step out of shadows into light. As the final note faded, Ethan looked straight at his father and whispered, "For Mom." The audience gasped, then applauded, some rising to their feet. Daniel closed his eyes, overcome by a grief that no longer hollowed him out, but instead flowed into gratitude. Grace reached for his hand, steady and warm, grounding him in the present. "He's healing," she murmured. Daniel turned to her, words catching in his throat. "So am I." Later that night, when the center was quiet and Ethan slept in a corner room, Daniel found Grace standing by the piano. He stepped closer, his voice unsteady but certain. "That wrong call I made. It was the best mistake of my life." Grace's smile trembled with tears. He reached for her hand, not as a CEO extending gratitude, but as a man asking for something more. She didn't pull away. The Harmony Center grew in the months that followed, becoming a beacon for families who had lost hope. Grace found her calling again, not bound by classrooms, but by compassion. Daniel balanced board meetings with afternoons at the center, discovering that success measured in healed smiles meant more than profit margins. And Ethan, once silent, now filled their home with music, his laughter echoing through hallways that had been empty for too long. In time, the three of them stood not as a CEO, a fallen teacher, and a lonely child, but as a family bound by resilience and love. Their story became a quiet reminder that sometimes the path to healing begins with what looks like a mistake. Sometimes the wrong call is exactly the one you were meant to make. Sometimes the greatest miracles don't come from wealth, plans, or perfect choices. They arrive in the shape of a mistake, a wrong call, a stranger at the door, a child's laughter returning after years of silence. For Daniel, a powerful CEO, it wasn't another contract that saved him. It was the courage of his son, the compassion of a woman the world had misjudged, and the reminder that family is built on love, not titles. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs hope today. Don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe to Soul-Stirring Tales for more stories that remind us, even in our darkest chapters, second chances are always possible.